Try to figure out how to give you the power to do that.
And just a reminder to sign into the doc. I see we have a section for today. Oops, I'm signing and talking. Okay, so I guess we can get started with status updates. I can share, so we ended up cutting our 0.10.2 patch on Monday with the bump to GGCR and a bug fix from DigitalOcean, which was very cool. And then this week I have been working on the Buildpack package refactor, which is progressing, and I hope to maybe share some general direction on how I'm going at some point. And also taking a look at Jesse's PRs.
Yeah, I've got a couple PRs out, for one for acceptance test, and I've got a spec PR that's sort of holding up the implementation of that spec PR. They're both very minor though, so I'm just kind of waiting on those to work their way through the approval system, and then yeah, that's all I've got this week.
Cool. Dan and I are working on 2 issues that relates to the default process RFC. I think that we finally understand all the scenarios, like with the different platform APIs, Buildpack API, all the mixing, all the options. And I hope that today or tomorrow we'll have we'll put a PR, everything. That's it. And Jesse, I'm sorry, I hope to review your RFC.
No, it's a no rush. I'm just making sure I'm not missing any, I don't know exactly how things get assigned or who's supposed to review stuff, so I'm just trying to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. So.
I've once again been very busy with non-life cycle things. I think that'll continue to be true for at least a couple of weeks.
Oh, I have one more thing to share regarding the question that I put a week or 2 ago about the Go mod at GoSum. I'm having some conversations with, maybe I put it in our Slack channel. Oh, although it's in the VMware Slack channel. So forget about it. I'm having some conversation with people that are kind of, should be considered as experts in Golang about the Go mode and GoSum. I hope that we'll discover what happened there. If any of you is interested, I would love to, investigate it with you as well.
My only update is kind of a non-update as well. Besides submitting the SID RFC, I've been kind of distracted with other stuff, unfortunately. But definitely looking to address your comments on there. Thanks everyone who commented so far, and happy to talk about it further here too, deeper in the agenda.
So I guess we can move on to release planning. Don't know much has changed since last week. So maybe it makes sense to just move on, or should we take a look at the milestone? Yeah. I don't think anything changed. So, all right. So then moving on, we have a standing item needs discussion. Looks like there is one from Jesse.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess I'll share it. It was briefly brought up in another context. Let me see if I can. Here we go. Yeah, so this is actually a Windows and sort of Linux incompatibility. The way we name the directories for volume caching is not valid on Windows. It wasn't a problem until it suddenly was in CI when it couldn't check out the repo. And so I had to rebase and rewrite those commits to have friendly names that could be checked out on Windows. And so it just kind of led me to think that we should at least discuss what that, what changing it might look like, or whether we'd want to continue supporting sort of both paths. Because I know there's some runtime translation. If it's Windows, it looks for them named a different way. But just from a platform perspective, I think it would be kind of nice to consolidate to a single directory name. But there's a lot of things to consider that I think I was talking to Emily in a side conversation briefly, and it's like, oh, we don't have versions in the metadata, and we don't have, then you've got to kind of make decisions around, do you rename old folders when a new life cycle is bumped, or stuff like that. So anyway, just open for discussion. I don't have a solution or anything to this problem.
I think to really solve this and other problems that I think will arise as we want to make other changes to the cache metadata. Like I could see us wanting to make sure that we're only restoring caches that were for the correct stack or stuff like that. I think we then need to, right now the cache format is totally left out of the platform API, but I think we should need to roll that into the platform API probably. So then you could have a, like API number in the cache metadata, and we could do translations or whatever it is we have to do. I think it will create an issue where right now you can kind of use a new platform API and then fall back to an older lifecycle with an older platform API, and the same cache can still be used. We'll probably have to, I think maybe the first step is just building in a default into the lifecycle. Let's say the 05 API. I think the first step would be if it sees 06 data, which doesn't exist yet, it throws a nice error. Stuff like that. So I think there's just some thought about how we thread all this metadata through.
Yeah, I guess this metadata, it exists in the cache images as well. I haven't looked at the cache images. I assume the same metadata exists either as a label or in there somewhere.
Yeah, there's a file in the directory that has the same contents as a label on the image cache.
Yeah, that's where I'm a bit confused. Like a platform perspective where you build both Windows and Linux and you don't really know where it's going to go. Like I'm sort of worried that they might just pull volume down, and it might be intended for Windows, but I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what, like you said, we probably need some platform information in that cache so that when Lifecycle is pulling it up, it ignores it properly if it's not for the right platform. If you switch from Windows to Linux or something like that with the same image names and same caches.
And forgive my ignorance on it. Is the main concern about, and the main motivation to spec this out and version it to prevent cache misses on an upgrade? Like we would have old caches that if we were to make this change, they would just be ignored, or are there bigger consequences than that?
Like I think we could already build in something so that on upgrade you migrate to the new data.
Yeah,
but then you wouldn't be able to downgrade. And we could use lifecycle version information to sort of describe what's going wrong to people, but we typically don't. At this point, all of the descriptions of what does and doesn't work is in the language of APIs, right? Rather than lifecycle versions. And I don't know if we want to make people think about both lifecycle versions and API versions when they're doing compatibility.
Yeah. Yeah, and I put it down here. We could do nothing for now. Like it's really just affecting us writing acceptance tests. But as soon as we have some of the features that Emily was talking about, trying to bust the cache if the stack was changed or prevent platform, things like we probably can't do that because there's not enough information in the metadata today to make those decisions in the future. So. Anyway, I don't think there's anything else to discuss there. I can remove the label. Maybe I could create an issue in lifecycle that is pretty broadly suggesting that we add more data to the metadata, and then whatever that looks like, we'll spec it out, and from there or something like that. If that sounds good.
Awesome. All right. So I guess moving on.
Oh, sorry, guys, I have to take a phone call. I'll be right back.
We're sort of continuing with agenda items from previous weeks. I had put, I think this is mine. I had put my draft PR up as a discussion item. I think last week when I was feeling very, very, very uncertain about the direction. Since then, I got some feedback from Emily, and I've done a little bit more work in like rewriting the detector tests to use new abstractions that I feel more confident in the direction, but there are like some very specific areas where I have questions. So maybe it makes sense for me to like kind of get the work in a complete state, and then when the PR is ready, I can like make comments to point out the areas that I'm looking for feedback. That makes sense.
Also,
That sounds great.
Maybe next week you can share. I mean, unless you'll put the PR like very soon, maybe you can share like show the PR, and then it will be easier to review it.
Yeah, we had talked about, I remember in previous, like last year at some point, we talked about that it'd be nice to do more like kind of show and tell and like looking at the code together. So this could actually probably be a nice reason to do that. So yeah.
For sure.
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right, so I'll table that I guess for next week. So moving on, we have GoSum and GoMod questions.
Yeah, I put this. So there are like two questions that, as I said before, I posted in like a VMware's Golang channel, but I can share it also with you. So the first thing is that all this discussion came up because we had this issue with GCR and all of this. So we started looking at our GoMod and GoSum files. And I saw that there are some like lines with a comment that's saying these lines are indirect. And I said, I was wondering, what are these? And I decided just to remove all of them. And I ran make all, and everything passed successfully. And I was wondering, why do we have them? I know that sometimes when you're running go mod tidy, it deletes them, and sometimes it's not. But if you're manually doing this, then it looks like we don't really need them. So I was wondering why they were being added like from the first place. And the other question was that after I pushed my last PR, I think, then Nali told me that she's running like make unit or make build, I don't remember exactly what, on her local machine, and she's seeing changes in Go mod and Go some files. And I did the same, same commits, everything was exactly the same on my machine. Everything was like clean. And we're worried that when GitHub will do this, and we will get like a dirty image because it will see some changes. So again, we're not really sure what happened. We saw that there is a bit different. We're using different minor versions of Go. And also there are a few packages under the Go path that Nali is having and I don't have. But anyway, it's like two open questions that I have no idea what's going on there. So if anyone has any experience with these kind of issues, I would love to hear it.
I feel like everyone has experience with these issues in Go, unfortunately. Now, I don't know whether anyone has any solutions. I think the indirect stuff, it all boils down to Docker not being a Go module, if I'm not mistaken. Like the version we're still using is not an actual like Go mod module. And so I think some of those indirects come from there and like their dependencies. I don't know why they're necessarily brought in and how it works without them being in the Go mod when you manually do it. Yeah, I know I think there were some changes in one of the PRs I did as well with like the Go mod tidy or something did it updated as well. And I think it was the tools folder, which is a whole nother concept that is really confusing if you haven't done it before. And I think they're changing it in upcoming Go. So like maybe we can dump the tools folder in Go 2 or whatever version they're going to ship that in. But yeah.
Yeah, someone suggested me just to change this file to be like read only and then by the make file, and then we will need to write things down. But I'm not very happy with this idea because it's very easy that it just created automatically. But
yeah, I know there's some, it's not Go vet, but there's something, is it Go mod? Anyway, there's something that we use to, or we run on quite a number of our Go repos that will fail CI if the repo's dirty before you go to the next step, right? So you always run Go mod, Go tidy or whatever, and then bail. So we can at least do that to prevent the dirty images problem.
yeah.
But I don't know if we can avoid it ever happening.
Emily, it looks like you have something to say.
I was just looking up when it adds this and when it doesn't. I can put something in the chat here. This is just my internet perusing, but it seems like it adds, this is basically what Jesse said, but it adds indirect dependencies only when your direct dependency doesn't have a Go mod. So any indirect dependency from a dependency that isn't using Go mod will get recorded as indirect. But it seems like there's a slight difference in behavior between when Go build and Go test add these versus when Go mod tidy does. Because according to this comment, Go mod tidy does this for all architectures, whereas Go build and Go test only do it for the one you're using. So I can imagine that this is why we see inconsistencies. Because someone's running Go build on Mac, but then you're not getting all the indirect dependencies that only happen when you're compiling for Windows, but Go mod tidy would add them, that kind of thing. So I wonder if we just add a check in our make file that ensures Go mod tidy that runs Go mod tidy as part of the process and also like fails the build if there was any diff. I feel like that should suffice.
So
That makes sense, the architecture. I hadn't thought about that.
So Natalie brought up last week a few lines from the pack make file that we probably can add to run like Go mod tidy. It's still weird because Natalie and I ran the same. We're both running on Mac using a Mac machine, and we ran the same exact commands.
If they were indirects that are showing up in one versus not the other, it could be like that your non-Go mod version of that, like the Docker, if those are not the exact same, then like it could be pulling in different indirect dependencies, like because as they were added naturally to Docker, who doesn't use Go mod, then they'll get slurped in by the Go mod tidy on one person's computer, but not on the other because it has to like navigate the Go source tree to figure out the dependencies, I think, or whatever.
But again, then when I deleted all the indirect files, everything like worked without. I mean, I did.
That's just a documentation thing, basically. Like, I don't think it actually affects the build process. It basically just pulls it in just to like document that these are the things that were pulled in when this person had this thing that's not a Go module there. So I think it all probably stems to having different versions potentially in your like Go directory of a dependency that's not a Go module. And then it sort of cascades out into all of its dependencies that potentially could make this different, just reading what Emily was putting there.
Interesting. I don't have anything to add about this. It's
terrible.
It's terrible and interesting at the same time.
Yeah, I would say it's not interesting. It's awful. This has been my least favorite part of moving to Go ever, and it continues to be the biggest pain point I've ever had with any language like that has any dependency management. The refusal to do this earlier is baffling.
Go itself used to be terrible. I feel like mod does solve the problems, right? If Docker just
Docker is
Go
our
mod,
problem.
like we would have forgotten that dependency management in Go used to be bad. The problem is we have this one really important dependency that pulls in a million indirect dependencies, and it's the one that isn't using Go mod.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you for helping me understand a little bit what could be the problem. I guess we can move on.
So we have this meta question about whether we need an hour or 30 minutes. Maybe should we cover the last agenda item and come back, or do we want to discuss it now?
I think that was brought over from last week. I think we decided we were going to try to do the hour. I feel like I got an invite on my personal email that said it was for an hour. So I don't know who updated it, but.
Nolly.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I extended it to an hour for the week when it looks like we're going to finish in 30 minutes, but let's keep going.
This one might exceed an hour.
It looks like Windows did RFP that you okay?
Yeah. I did, and here I'll put a link into the discussion to. Oops, that's not how you do it. Thank you all for who had read through that already, and for the comments that are on there. I was kind of thinking if it's useful, I could give kind of just the verbal summary if anyone wants to know kind of what's intended there, and then there were a couple more like controversial things that probably would be best solved in conversation after that. But how folks feel about a summary of the changes, or a thumbs up if yes, or thumbs down if you feel like you've already read through and got the gist of it?
Although I already read it, I think it's really great.
I mean, I'll give it a shot. And it was, I'm not by no means pro at reading RFCs or writing RFCs, not reading them for that matter. So it definitely probably a bit verbose. So the gist, and would it be more useful if I shared my screen, or y'all feel all right?
I think it's always useful. Share the screen, especially for the recording.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, good call. So I shall. I'm going to see how well I can make do just sharing the browser window. But here's the readable text. I feel like the important bit is here kind of at the beginning, is that the spec states some behavior that we might not actually care to implement, and it is not yet implemented as written, namely that in build images and run images that the CNB user ID should be an SID on Windows. And SID is kind of this special way of identifying an individual user on a Windows system, but very similar to a Unix UID. It's just much more verbose, but intending to do the same thing, unique identifier in a system. This doesn't show all the places where the spec states the SID behavior. There's also talks about the group ID or for the group value as well. And what I was kind of hoping before we actually attempted to implement it this way, and based on a lot of other feedback that folks had submitted to and issues, that we probably don't actually want to overload this environment variable with the SID format. Right now, the UID is an integer, group ID is integer, works fine, and then the SID is this special string that has a series of integers. Surprisingly, Windows users are probably familiar with this format, so they would look at it and say, oh, that's SID, I know what that is. So it's not really that esoteric of a format, but it's a misfit for the particular variable that we're already using. So the suggestion here was for the user-facing values to switch over to calling it CNB user or CNB owner SID, and that kind of matches the internal Windows definition for what that field is called when it's saved to a file. It's the owner and the group as opposed to the user and the group for Unix IDs. And so seeing that value for a user probably wouldn't be too surprising. They would just put it inside their stack images, and then it would just percolate on through the system, go from the platform down to the implementations through pack. I had originally suggested maybe just keeping these same flags on here, but don't really feel strongly that they should be that they should accommodate both for the implementations. But then as it goes to the implementations, all images that are written by an implementation or a platform would, instead of writing, and as we know, those are tar formats, instead of writing to the UID field, it writes to the special Windows field, which is talked about a little bit more down here. But yeah, the net effect is that the permission that a user chose in the stack image is the one that ends up being applied to the sort of user-owned files inside of all those images. Very parallel to what happens already on all the Linux images. Now, what's probably also a little bit confusing is that's all well and good, but something happens now today, and there is some conversion that happens in ImageUtil and used in both pack and lifecycle, where this CNB user ID is converted into a Windows permission. And it's pretty hand wavy how it works. Rather than picking a very specific SID to convert it to, we instead convert it to another valid SID or a proxy for an SID. No, sorry, it is a specific SID. That's for a group instead of a specific user. It says that anything that is 0 or root owned, if you were to choose a 0 for this, it's owned by the administrators group. And if this value is ever not 0, then the final image that's written is owned by the any user group. So the permissions are pretty lax now today. So again, the general gist is to make the Windows implementation work as close as possible to the Linux implementation, remove the translation logic that's there today, but have it very clearly two different variables for Windows rather than overloading the CNB user ID. Kind of bounced around there a little bit. Any questions, kind of high level of how this works?
I have some thoughts about some things that are later, but I don't know whether I should ask it now.
Let's hold on just one sec. If there's any like clarifying questions or questions about like what the user experience is going to be like or anything like that.
Yeah, so these images, are they already going to have these users created, much like the build and run images for Linux? Like whoever builds a base Windows image will have to create these users, I guess, figure out their SID and GIDs or whatever and put them here.
It's a great question. There's a much more de facto standard for Windows images today, or specifically like Windows hosts. Docker has hard-coded SID in here that corresponds to the container user. There's also if you oh wait no sorry I think this is probably container administrator. If this is a 2, it's instead container administrator. Those are hard-coded in Docker and in containerd. So there's always guaranteed those 2 users to be present. And I think de facto, all Windows stacks will correspond to one of those 2 users. It is possible to create your own user that isn't one of those. But then it gets much messier to predict what that SID is going to be. In fact, it's impossible to predict what it's going to be. You'd have to do some magic where you would create a user offline, find out what that SID was that was created in there, and then go and write it back into a later layer in your image or modify your image metadata. So in practice, no one's going to try and make a user and put their SID in there in the same one.
Okay.
It would be, and your question there in the thread was good too, and I'll give you a better response in there in line.
Okay. Yeah, I was also just figuring when you said Docker hard codes them, those are sort of some of my concerns. Like, you know, in the Docker experience, if someone chooses a different SID, is Docker going to make these volumes inaccessible to that user? Things like that.
Yeah, what I would guess, like if a user really wanted to do that, I'd probably recommend them to use a group ID rather than a specific user SID. And as they make that user, ensure they're part of that group whose ID doesn't change. And Windows has a whole bunch of pre-existing groups too that could probably give you the permissions that you want.
I think what's nice about the fact that there's such strong defaults in Windows is that unlike the Linux version of this, we could probably make this optional and just default to the good defaults, which would be a good experience for users. Like, I think most people wouldn't have to think about it. The only people who would have to think about it are folks that are already well versed in this stuff because they're already going through a lot of effort to change the SIDs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think they're very like Docker is very unlikely to ever change these constants too, because they have a whole constellation of images that have been created based on them. And I think technically, Microsoft even has some images that are not exactly Docker images that seem to rely on these values being present, like inside the Windows base images. I found a few files owned by some of these SIDs, so it seems very static. And I like that idea of the default.
Yeah.
Just a small question about what we have today.
Mhm.
It's like we're only having a translation in order to make things work on Windows, right? Okay.
Yeah, right now that translation happens over here in ImageUtil, where whenever it encounters an existing layer tar that has the Unix UID set, it will go and convert it to these either container administrator, or no, that I keep saying container administrator. Looks like there's a typo there too. I don't know why that's not resolving already, but this is the SID in here is the SID for this group. And so right now, every file is owned by either, or every file that's created by pack or lifecycle is either owned by built-in administrators or by built-in users.
And it's not good enough because we just want to have like a real SID, right?
Yeah, the real SID is nice to make it tighter security at the end of the day, but it's really the divergent behavior from Linux and Windows that I think is probably going to bite all of us. Just sometime down the road, we'll be troubleshooting a user report that says my app got this user ID and I don't, SID, or my file got this SID and it's not working and I want to know why. And I feel like if it's a very specific SID, the one that matched that came from the stack, it's like you don't need to know that much Windows, or a lot of the Linux documentation will match up with the reasons there. But So yeah, I haven't heard any anecdotal concerns about this from users. To your point, yeah. And maybe that speaks to timing too. So we're not super urgent to get this in. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. This is, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but you mentioned that this logic is used both in pack and the life cycle, right? So in theory, like pack is also going to be making changes to how it creates like builders, right? The permissions that are written in the builder.
Mhm.
Does that have any like versioning problem with the like an older builder and a newer life cycle, or vice versa, that we need to worry about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it'd be so our oldest images out there, right? So if a new pack, we're using an older builder that had older permissions, I feel like we might be okay because we're going from more permissive permissions on current builders, build packages, and app images today to more restrictive ones that we'd be going to apply. I can't think of a scenario with my limited ability to think right now where that would catch us up. I mean, I guess you could have a build pack that was relying on these very permissive permissions to do its magic. But given how few Windows build packs are out there right now, I'm hopeful that there isn't. And I feel like, and I kind of, it's very kind of hand wavy, like migration suggestions, but like, as I was putting these together, I was trying to kind of keep that in mind, how to transition each of these so that we kind of make the shared library first and then can use it in pack and lifecycle. And I don't know, I'm not remembering too well all the scenarios that I had thought through. I guess I could potentially add those in the RFC just so we can reason about it a little bit better. That might be a good idea.
I feel like one of the things that's different between Linux and Windows right now, and also between how Lifecycle and Pack use image util, is that Pack basically only has two cases in both Linux and Windows, where it's either like in Linux it wants a root owned thing or it wants a stack user owned thing. In Lifecycle we have stack user owned things, but we also have their parent directories that we have to put in folders, and we want to keep whatever permissions they currently have. So I'm a little leery of helpers that are aggressively going to change all the SIDs, because I think we actually want to be in the lifecycle, have sort of fine-grained control for each and every entry, like what SID it has. And we have sort of a schema for tar writers there that would make that pretty easy to do in Windows in a way that's analogous to how we do it in Linux. So I guess my request would be sort of that whatever there's good image util defaulting behavior that could be very helpful to pack. Like it to be cautious and never override things that are coming in with these values set on purpose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think we can actually get rid of some of the sort of smart translation and instead have both lifecycle and pack. Everywhere they're setting a very explicit UID, there'll be a line below it that sets a very explicit SID if it's a Windows image. And the helpers I was thinking on image util would generally just be ways to convert a SID into the binary representation needed there. So I would hope that actually we get even more fine grained for free. And I would also hope that we, like, every time that we add a new line where we're explicitly setting a UID or a GID, it just becomes pretty automatic to set the the corresponding SID one after that. And maybe there's some little helpers that make the syntax easier there, but
Yeah, that sounds perfect to me. I'd rather favor explicit over magic.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I also kind of like how the archive packages are emerging in the different the pack and lifecycle, and it definitely feels like lower level stuff is going on there in lifecycle. So I was trying to reason through this with that in mind. Just to touch on that a little bit more, the part that makes some of this complex of converting from, say, this sort of representation into the thing that needs to be recorded on the tar header is that the implementation on Windows right now is actually only available through a syscall. So I had to do some reasoning and some bit banging to actually figure out how to do that. But the implementation that I have somewhere is pretty tidy. It does just do that. It just converts a straight up SID into its binary representation. I'm hopeful that that becomes. I searched as far and wide as I could to find someone else who's doing that, particularly for writing these particular fields. And I didn't find anyone who's using anything besides the built-in Windows, the Windows authored security descriptors. So I hope whatever implementation we adopt kind of becomes more widely used, and obviously is, lends credence to us doing Windows stuff well. But also long term, I would hope that Microsoft can provide an implementation for that, or they we don't always have to handle every edge case that's possible with this values for this field. I can't really find that prototype either.
I saw it in there before. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably the scariest part about this for me. It's just knowing that I know SIDs have been around for a long time, and like you said, this is sort of a known thing, but it's still sort of scary that when Windows 11 ships, whenever they decide to ever make another version, if they do decide to do something to make containers permissions better or something, we're gonna have to chase that or something.
Yeah.
I bet on image util where we have this helper, we could have a test that runs only on Windows that like does a syscall and calls our thing and just compares the results. That way we'll get a heads up if something goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. We could write this directly to the file system as the header for a file system file and make sure that Windows can still read it. It wouldn't be necessarily in a container, but you could do both containerized tests and raw file system tests. And also to that point, there is this is a reference implementation written in C#. Technically, this is not the syscall, or at least to my knowledge. I'm not exactly sure what the implementation of the Windows syscall is, but here's an equivalent implementation, but it's in C#. If we really wanted to, we could just compile this into a binary that we shell out to and have it do the syscall, the security descriptor creation. There just wasn't a good Golang implementation that wasn't just a wrapper around the syscall.
I'm not super worried about this changing because I feel like if it changed in an incompatible way, it would hose Windows in general, right?
Yep.
Because there's tar files out in the world with these things. They can't just make a breaking change to this format. So if we have a working Golang implementation, I feel like we should just use it, not worry too much about it.
Cool. Yeah, one of the bit too is we can always use like just PowerShell to give us test values to compare against. It's really, we got a bunch of reference implementations floating around. So that's, any other questions kind of about the specifics of the value for that field? It's pretty dense in here, so if y'all read through it later, and if anything comes up, feel free to post in there. Yeah, anything else y'all have? I kind of
Very
keep
good
going on
question
some
that
of
I
these
also
drawbacks.
left in the RFC, which is right now, like this does a very good job of covering how these values are used when generating layers and the permissions in layers. There are a couple other ways the current UID and GID values are used in lifecycle, in terms of how we use them to figure out what permissions to drop to after we do things that need to be privileged. And I was wondering how that ties into this. Like, first of all, do we have the same problems in Windows that we have in Linux for why we're doing this? Like, do we need to run as root to connect to the Docker daemon socket? I mean, not root, administrator. And even if we don't, I assume like it could come up if we ever did root Buildpacks for Windows, but it'll probably be 10 million years before we get around to that. So that, I'm just wondering, like, if we ever had to worry about permission user changes in process, in lifecycle, in Windows, do we use the values you're passing in to do the file permissions to make that change? And if we think that's something we might want to do in the future, like, do we want to call it user SID instead of owner SID? Because we'll use, that user is the owner of the file, so owner makes sense in the file context, but user might make sense for a wider variety of contexts that we need.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I feel like we would also want to do that. There is like a impersonation feature in the Windows API to kind of drop privileges, and you do need container administrator privileges to access the Docker socket. And I guess I don't quite understand why we hadn't been bitten by that yet. But yeah, and the naming too, yeah, that does kind of make sense. Like we did kind of benefit from the UID or the naming originally, because the UID and user meant the same thing in those contexts. But yeah, as you said, I wonder if that does feel like a better fit of CNB user SID, or is it too? I mean, maybe it's too subtle at the environment variable level, but like maybe it's fine still too. But then I feel like a Windows user, that would be fine for them. So if we wanted to go with CNB user SID, I think that makes sense.
It'd be more generic.
Mhm.
And then we should change lifecycle to actually do the permission dropping. I don't know why it works now. Well, actually, I do. Which is we just don't drop permissions. We're probably running the whole build as administrator.
Yeah, it's not at all unreasonable that it works that way right now. And having this SID would let us actually drop. So that would be a good thing. I think I did do a stab at I forget what that function is in lifecycle, but it wasn't. It made me feel like I could do it, but I just didn't do it. Yeah. What we're talking about too is we're talking about these flags too. I originally kept them the same way. Just I don't know. I'm not sure I went with that changing and this not changing, but I would also be fine with that changing. It just feels like it makes the CLI flags a little more complex, but they still just can switch on the goose flag, and it shouldn't matter.
I feel like the same reasons for changing the environment variable apply to the flags, right? Which is we have a type for these flags that we're using in the flag library, and it's not something that we couldn't work around in both cases if we wanted to keep them the same. But if we're making one different, I don't see why we would make the other different. And also we sort of very directly map from environment variable to flag for all of our existing configuration options. And this one being slightly different feels like maybe we should just change the flag name too.
Yeah. How do other folks feel? I mean, I guess I could do it more formally in the RFC, just see what folks' opinions are. But if we went with owner SID for or O SID for flag, is that what you're thinking? I forget.
Do we say user to make it more generic, or do we still think owner's the right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, USID and GSID when Windows set, right?
Yeah, I like being distinct flags. Like, I think it just makes the most sense for validation reasons and just ease of use.
Also thinking about the help text, like if I run lifecycle help, you can make it so that on Windows, it only prints the Windows flags. And on Linux, it only prints the Linux flags. And then we don't have to have in the description, like if Windows, it means this, if Unix, this.
Cool. Yeah, I'll update the RFC with that suggestion, and then, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think that was covered most of the controversial bits. We can sort everything else out in the comments, and y'all have comments already, so I'll respond to those and update it. So thank you for doing that. Anything else?
If this was any indication, it seems like we probably need the hour. I think we should also add going over RFCs that are labeled with implementation to our standing items, maybe. Maybe a standing item at the end, so we have time for whatever's most pressing to people, and then we can fill the remaining hour, because I'm sure there's always going to be things to talk about in the RFCs.
Do we want to take a glance in the remaining 6 minutes?
I did pop it open, and right now there's 2 in final comment period, and there's the one we just discussed. But in general, I think more will come in.
Is one of the ones the what's it called? The layer toml RFC?
Yeah.
I actually had a question about that.
Now let's do it.
Should I share? Okay. Let me pull it up. No. So this went into final comment period a week ago, but we had
We don't see your screen if you're trying to share.
There was an open question about the label, which I brought up because it encodes, this label encodes information that's in analyze.toml, which is derived from the layer tomls. And essentially, like, since you kind of threw out the key renaming from this RFC, it's really would be about adding types to that label. And I know there's an argument to be made kind of on either side. I was sort of wondering, I'm kind of making the argument here that, like, it's already a little different from what we have in layer toml. So what's one more slight change to, avoid more work, right? Essentially. But I don't
Sounds
know.
Convincing to me.
Yeah.
I should open an RFC to improve it eventually. But I'm okay leaving it as is for now.
Okay. Is it possible you just respond to this particular one, I think, and then we can merge it.
Move that tomorrow, yeah. I forget who's running this particular ticket, but yeah. I think they were waiting on Emily's response. So.
I think I'm the ticket shepherd, so
Sherpa.
I'll just merge it. Yeah. I was actually going to merge it yesterday, even though this was still open, because I was like, this is a Buildpack API change. We can either do it or not, but it'll be a separate spec PR.
I'm happy to be contradicted if it is better to change the label. I just don't know.
I'm not convinced it's better to change the label. I feel like you can make a good argument on either side. Happy to do what's easiest for right now.
Yeah, the life cycle downgrade problem, I mean, we've mentioned this a couple of times already, right? Like, I don't know how real is that, like, you know, how often do we see that in the wild? But it does seem like it's something that we come across every so often as a reason not to do things.
Sorry, I was typing and closing it out and I missed the last part of that.
No, I was just highlighting the life cycle downgrade problem, and because I know that, you know, for the cache rename, you know, question, that's also a concern, right? Is that something that we need to worry about?
Yeah, I think it's almost the exact same problem.
I don't know if there's anything on the labels that sort of versions which lifecycle it was built with, or which platform API it was built with, I guess would be the more, you know,
Yeah,
correct
like we
way of
do
wording it.
have that information sort of indirectly. Like there's a launcher version. There's either directly a lifecycle version that we put in, or there's a launcher version, but the launcher version is always the same as the lifecycle version that built it. So you could figure it out, but it's, again, in terms of lifecycle versions, we may want to move over to API versions.
Yeah, I could see this becoming an issue because obviously labels are pretty nice abstraction for getting info out without having to crack open an image, and for a platform that maybe allows someone to bring their own builder, if they have to go back and forth because of a breaking change of, like, you know, an upstream builder they don't control. It seems like downgrades would be something we definitely want to allow platforms to be able to support as best they can, and knowing that without having to make assumptions about what it is. And probably means we need to have like parsers for these metadatas in lifecycle that exist per version as well, potentially. So you could, like, you know, get the metadata out in a struct that matches what platform it was at some point.
We are at time. Should we adjourn but continue this discussion future meeting?
See y'all later.
I added a link to the RFCs to our standing items, so next week.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.